The courtroom was colder than it should have been, a kind of chill that seeped into the bones and made silence heavier. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of restless bodies, and the fluorescent lights hummed, relentless in their sterility. A little girl, no taller than the railing that divided the gallery from the stand, stood gripping a stuffed rabbit whose fur had long surrendered to years of clutching. She was 3, though her eyes carried something older, a shadow of nights when the world should have been soft but wasn't. At the far end, a German shepherd lay at her feet, his vest gleaming with the words "Pol-ICK-9." The dog's presence seemed out of place in this architecture of order and judgment, but his breathing was steady, his patience immense. The bailiff had hesitated when the animal padded across the polished floor, nails clicking, but no one stopped him. It was as if even the law bent under the child's trembling. Whispers scattered through the room as the judge looked down, unsure if she was about to witness justice or collapse. The girl's lips barely parted at first, voice fragile as cracked porcelain. But then she turned, not to the judge, not to the jury, not to the men in dark suits who had rehearsed her silence, but to the dog. She lowered herself onto her knees, pressed her forehead against his collar, and began to speak. Every syllable was soaked in the raw innocence of a child trying to explain a world gone cruel. Her words were not legal testimony. They were fragments of memory, images of doors slamming, voices rising, hands too heavy for her small shoulders. And yet, through her broken cadence, something impossible happened. The room fell into a stillness that felt holy. The jury leaned forward, the judge's gavel hand froze midair, and grown men who had spent careers untouched by tragedy found themselves blinking too often, as if dust had suddenly filled their eyes. No one had prepared for this. No one had written it into procedure or policy. But the truth, raw and unshielded, had found its way into the open. Not because the child was strong, not because the system was merciful, but because a dog had simply been there to listen. The nights never arrived quietly. They crashed into the small apartment like waves, carrying with them voices too sharp, footsteps too heavy, and the sound of glass breaking against walls meant to hold peace. For a child of 3, time had no shape, only the rhythm of fear marked its passing. She didn't know what day it was, only that the darkness brought the same ritual hiding beneath a blanket. Curling so small she hoped she might disappear into the fabric itself. Her world was measured in sounds. The slam of the front door when he came home too late. The crack of a belt against the table edge. Her mother's voice, pleading and breaking in the same breath, followed by the silence that always meant surrender. And then there was the sound she hated most. The silence that followed her own whimpers when she pressed her palms over her ears and no one came. Silence was not peace. Silence was the world looking away. She would clutch her stuffed rabbit then, a relic of better days, its once white fur now grey with age and tears. Its button eye dangled by a thread, but she believed if she held it tightly enough, it might keep her tethered. The apartment was cold, and the thin blanket carried the smell of mildew, but her small fingers gripped the toy as if it had a heartbeat. In those hours, the child became a ghost in her own home. She learned the art of vanishing, staying quiet, staying still, becoming nothing. Her breath was shallow, chest tight as though even the sound of air leaving her lungs might bring the storm back through her bedroom door. She didn't yet have words like trauma or abuse. She only had the feeling that her world was unsafe and that survival meant silence. The moon sometimes spilled through the window, silvering the cracks in the plaster walls. In that cold light, she would stare at shadows that shifted and stretched across the ceiling. Sometimes she thought the shadows were monsters, reaching to take her. Other times, she wished they would, just so the noise outside would end. Her tiny body ached with a heaviness too old for her years, but she never cried loudly. Crying invited notice, and notice was dangerous. The neighbors must have heard the thuds, the crashes, the screams. But walls are thin, and courage thinner. So the neighbors turned up their televisions, closed their blinds, and whispered in the hallways without ever knocking on the door. The child learned early that help did not come from walls, nor from adults who looked away. Morning always came as if nothing had happened. The world outside carried on. Buses growled down the street, Children laughed on their way to school, birds dared to sing. But inside the apartment, morning light only revealed what the night had left behind: a broken lamp, a bruised arm, a child too quiet for her age. She would sit at the kitchen table, legs swinging above the floor, staring at a bowl of cereal that had long gone soggy. Her mother's eyes were swollen, her voice brittle, but she tried to smile. "Eat, baby," she would say, and the girl would nod, spooning mouthfuls without tasting. She didn't know how to ask why the world hurt. She didn't know if she was allowed. At 3 years old, she carried silence like a second skin. Adults spoke around her, never to her. Caseworkers visited once, their pens scratching on clipboards, eyes scanning the room without settling. A few photographs were taken. Promises were murmured. "We'll look into this." But then the door closed, and the girl was once again left to the sound of her own heartbeat in the dark. It was in that silence that her voice began to wither. Words were dangerous. They might be overheard, twisted, punished. She learned to bury them deep inside, letting them gather like stones in her chest. Sometimes she mouthed words to her stuffed rabbit, but even then she whispered so softly that not even the toy could fully hear. The silence was not just around her. It was inside her, swallowing laughter before it could surface, turning questions into knots in her throat. She wanted to ask why her mother flinched at sudden noises. She wanted to ask why her father's face grew red and monstrous at night. She wanted to ask why love hurt. But silence had already taught her that questions could be fatal. And so, in that dim apartment, the child grew invisible. Her silence was her shield, but also her prison. Nights blurred into one another until she could no longer tell where fear ended and herself began. She was 3, but her soul already carried the weight of remembering what most children never should. What she didn't know then, what no one in those walls could have predicted, was that silence, so carefully crafted as her protection, would one day shatter in the unlikeliest of places, and that when it did, when words finally broke through her trembling lips, it would not be to the adults who had failed her, nor the cold authority of the court, but to a creature of fur and patience who would teach her that speaking could be safe. For now, though, there was only the silence. The long nights, the muffled cries, the shadows crawling across her ceiling. A little girl, 3 years old, pressing her face into a threadbare rabbit, waiting for a world that might never change. It began on a day when the world felt especially heavy. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and stale coffee, the kind that lingers in government offices, where stories like hers were shuffled into case files and filed away in grey cabinets. She was too young to know what protective services meant, too small to understand why strangers spoke in clipped voices while her mother sat in the corner, eyes fixed on the floor. She only knew that her stuffed rabbit had been taken from her hands at the security checkpoint, and her fingers twitched for the missing weight. The building buzzed with fluorescent lights that hummed like tired bees. People moved past in stiff suits, the click of their shoes echoing down the long linoleum hallways. The little girl's shoes made no sound. She shuffled slowly, her face buried in the sleeve of her oversized sweater. Her breath came shallow. Her eyes darted like a bird trapped in a cage. And then there was a sound. A soft click of nails against the floor, different from the hurried cadence of human feet. It came steady, deliberate, each step weighted with calm. She looked up, and the world shifted. At the end of the hallway stood a shepherd, tall and proud, his fur catching the overhead light in shades of copper and black. His vest bore the seal of authority, Police K9, but his eyes, deep and steady, carried none of the judgment that filled the room. His handler held the leash loosely, as if trusting the animal to make his own decisions. The girl froze. For a heartbeat, her chest seized with fear. Everything in her world that was big and loud had hurt her. But the shepherd lowered his head, his ears softening, his gaze fixed on hers with the patience of something older than time. He made no move, no sudden advance, only waited as if to say, "You decide." Her small hand, trembling, loosened from the fabric of her sleeve. She took a step forward, then another, each one as hesitant as the first words of a forgotten language. The shepherd waited. When she finally reached him, she extended her fingers, barely brushing the fur along his neck. His warmth radiated into her palm, steady and sure, and in that instant, the world's noise fell away. The handler knelt, voice low, explaining something to the caseworker, but the girl didn't hear. All she could feel was the slow rise and fall of the dog's breathing, the rhythm anchoring her in a way no adult voice ever had. She pressed her hand harder into his fur, then buried her face there, inhaling the scent of grass and leather and something earthy, something alive. For the first time, she did not shrink from touch. The shepherd did not demand words. He did not ask her to explain, or to testify, or to carry the weight of things too large for her. He simply stood, unyielding, as if he could absorb the tremors running through her small body. From that day on, he became her shadow in places that felt unbearable. Courtrooms, interviews, rooms filled with the sterile voices of lawyers and officials. She would grip his harness, fingers clutching leather instead of air, and he would lead her through spaces that might have otherwise swallowed her whole. At home, silence had been her prison. Here, silence felt different, shared, understood, not judged. When she couldn't form words, the shepherd seemed to listen anyway. His ears would twitch at her breath, his head tilt slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. And when she grew tired of trying, he would simply rest his head on her lap, reminding her that presence could speak louder than language. The girl began to test small sounds again. Hums, half-syllables, fragments of laughter. The shepherd never startled, never corrected, never pushed. When she whispered her rabbit's name one afternoon, barely audible, he responded with a single thump of his tail, as if sealing a pact. The adults didn't notice, but she did. She noticed everything. Her world, once sharp-edged and untrustworthy, now had a softness stitched into its fabric. A softness made of fur, breath, and patience. She began to sleep without clutching the rabbit so tightly, because she knew the shepherd would return. At night, in the dark spaces of her mind, she would imagine his steady eyes watching the shadows on her ceiling, keeping them at bay. The arrival of the shepherd was not an event marked in official records. No file, no report captured the quiet revolution taking place in a 3-year-old's chest, but it was the hinge on which her story would turn. Because one day, when the courtroom grew colder than any night she had endured, and the weight of adult expectation pressed against her fragile ribs, it would be the shepherd who reminded her she did not have to remain silent. It would be to him, and only him, that she would find the courage to finally speak. The courthouse was not built for children. Its ceilings loomed too high, swallowing voices into echo. Its doors were heavier than her entire body, slabs of oak that groaned when they closed behind her, sealing her into chambers of polished stone and unbending rules. The air was always too cold, as though the building itself was determined to remind everyone that feelings had no place here. The little girl sat in a hallway lined with benches that smelled of varnish and sweat. Men and women in pressed suits swept past, their arms full of folders that snapped shut like jaws. Words like custody, testimony, petition drifted overhead, each one carrying the sharpness of things she could not understand but somehow felt pressed against her skin. She clutched the shepherd's vest, her small fingers wrapping so tightly that her knuckles blanched white. The system called it due process. To her, it was a labyrinth of strangers who spoke in codes, their mouths moving without ever turning toward her. Every adult seemed to be performing for some invisible audience. The prosecutors rehearsed lines as though their words were weapons. The defense lawyers sculpted silence into armor. Even the judge, cloaked in black, looked less like a person and more like a wall carved from the very stone of the building. Walls. That was what this place was made of. Not just brick and plaster, but invisible ones built from procedure and power. The girl could feel them everywhere. A wall stood between her and the grown-ups who argued about her future as if she weren't sitting 10 feet away. A wall divided her memories from the language she lacked to explain them. A wall surrounded her heart, a fragile barricade against the flood that waited behind her ribs. The shepherd was the only one who did not belong to the architecture. His breathing cut through the sterile air, his body warm and solid against her legs. While the lawyers spoke of evidence and statutes, she focused on the rise and fall of his flank, the rhythm reminding her that something in this space was alive and unchanging. She watched the adults talk about her as if she were a case file, not a child. Their voices rose and fell like waves battering against stone, but none of them asked her what it felt like to live inside those nights. They said the child may not be competent to testify, as though truth had an age limit. They said the trauma may impair her reliability, as though pain invalidated memory. They said everything except her name, which seemed to dissolve into the air each time it was spoken. The girl tugged at the shepherd's collar, her eyes drifting to the ceiling where fluorescent lights buzzed. She wondered if the system even noticed her silence, or if silence was exactly what it wanted. Because silence kept the machinery moving, allowed the gavel to fall, allowed decisions to be stamped without the mess of a child's trembling voice. The walls grew thicker as the days passed. Each meeting, each hearing, each hushed conversation in the hallway added another layer to the fortress built around her story. Sometimes she pressed her palm to the shepherd's chest and whispered nonsense words, sounds that made no sense but still carried the ache inside her. He listened, his ears twitched, and for those small moments she imagined her voice climbing the walls like ivy, finding cracks where no one else had looked. But the system was relentless. It did not wait for her to grow ready. Dates were set. Hearings were scheduled. Court orders stamped in ink dictated where she would live, with whom under what terms. Adults argued over her like two sides of a battlefield, each claiming justice, while she sat between them, a silent prisoner of walls that never asked her if she wanted freedom or merely safety. And yet there was something stirring beneath her silence. She began to notice how the shepherd tilted his head each time she tensed, how his presence interrupted the rhythm of the system. Adults, too, glanced at him more than at her, some with curiosity, others with discomfort, as though his steady gaze threatened their control. It was as if the dog himself was an uninvited witness, one who saw past the walls, who understood that silence was not emptiness, but the weight of words unsaid. In that courthouse, surrounded by barriers she could not climb, the girl began to imagine a moment when the walls might crack. She did not know when or how, but she knew that if her voice ever found its way out, it would not be in response to the judge's gavel or the lawyer's questions. It would be because of the shepherd's eyes, watching her as if he alone believed she was more than a file, more than a fragile thing to be decided upon. The system had built its walls, but the child had found her anchor, and deep inside, though no one yet knew, her silence was gathering force, like water pressing against stone, waiting for the day it would break through. The day she was to enter the courtroom arrived cloaked in a tension that pressed against her chest like invisible hands. Morning light slanted through the blinds of her temporary guardian's house, casting stripes across the floor that looked like prison bars. The girl sat at the edge of the couch, shoes dangling above the carpet, fingers twisting the ear of her rabbit until the stitching pulled loose. She did not understand calendars or summonses, but she understood the weight in the air, the hush in the voices around her, the way the adults dressed in black and gray instead of colors, the way her guardian's hand lingered too long on her shoulder before letting go. The car ride was quiet, except for the hum of the engine. Buildings slid past her window, tall and impersonal, until they gave way to the courthouse looming like a fortress. Its steps stretched wide and cold, stone carved to intimidate. She hesitated at the bottom, her breath fogging in the cool morning air. People streamed past her, lawyers with briefcases, officers with stern faces, but she stood frozen until a sudden nudge at her leg reminded her she was not alone. The shepherd walked at her side, his stride unhurried, his presence grounding. His vest gleamed in the pale light, letters bold across his side. But to her he was not authority, he was refuge. She clutched his harness, small fingers pressing against the leather, and together they climbed the steps into the belly of the building. Inside, the courthouse smelled of paper, polish, and nerves. The walls hummed with a low drone of voices. Arguments rehearsed, strategies whispered. Doors slammed with echoes that carried down long corridors. The girl flinched at each sudden sound, but the shepherd's steady gait reminded her to keep moving. When the courtroom doors opened, a wave of unfamiliar air washed over her. It was colder inside, the kind of cold that lived not in temperature but in judgment. Rows of benches lined the space, filled with faces that turned as she entered. Their eyes landed on her with the weight of expectation, strangers deciding what her story meant before she spoke a word. She shrank into herself, her shoulders curling forward as if she could vanish into the shepherd's shadow. The judge sat elevated, robes pooling like dark water around her chair. The jury box was filled with people who tried to look impartial but whose eyes betrayed curiosity, pity, even doubt. On the opposite side of the room, the accused sat rigid, hands folded, expression unreadable. The girl's throat tightened at the sight. Her body remembered what her mind tried to bury. She pressed her face briefly into the shepherd's fur, breathing in the scent of earth and leather, before daring to look up again. The bailiff's voice rang out, formal and booming, each word slicing the silence. Papers rustled, chairs creaked, pens clicked against notepads. The little girl stood in the eye of it all, a tiny figure against towering structures of law and power. Her knees wobbled. She felt the eyes on her, 1,000 invisible threads pulling her apart. The courtroom was a storm, and she was its fragile center. They asked her to approach the witness stand. The path stretched longer than it should have, each step an eternity. Her shoes squeaked against the polished floor. She tightened her grip on the shepherd's harness, her other hand clutching the worn rabbit, and together they walked toward the chair that seemed carved to dwarf her. She was lifted onto the stand, her legs swinging, unable to touch the floor. The microphone loomed before her, cold metal waiting to amplify a voice she had never trusted. The judge leaned forward, expression softened but distant. Lawyers shuffled papers, eyes trained on her like hunters waiting for movement. She sat frozen, the room's breath pressing against her skin. The shepherd positioned himself at her feet, his body a barrier between her and the abyss. He settled into place without command, his presence filling the emptiness where courage should have been. His breathing was steady, his eyes fixed on her, as if to remind her that she was not trapped alone. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence thickened until it felt unbearable. She could feel the impatience of the adults, their need for words, for testimony, for evidence wrapped in the fragile shell of her small voice. But the girl could not speak. The courtroom was too large, the people too many, the fear too sharp. Her throat closed, her lips parted, but no sound came. The judge tilted her head, the lawyers exchanged glances, the gallery shifted in restless discomfort. And then, she looked down into the shepherd's eyes, deep and calm, a steady pool unbroken by the storm around them. His tail gave a single, slow wag. He did not demand. He did not rush. He simply waited. And in that waiting, she felt the first flicker of possibility. That her words might belong to someone who would hold them gently. She leaned forward, almost collapsing off the stand, and pressed her forehead against the dog's collar. The microphone missed her words, but the courtroom did not. Her lips moved, trembling, and sound finally broke through. Not to the judge, not to the lawyers, not to the walls that towered around her, but to the shepherd, whose ears twitched as if catching every syllable. It was the day of the courtroom, the day her silence cracked. And though the system was not built to understand it, everyone present knew something extraordinary had begun. The silence stretched so long that the air itself seemed to tremble. The judge leaned forward slightly, lips pressed tight, while the attorneys shifted in their seats, their pens hovering useless above their notepads. The little girl's chest rose and fell in uneven bursts, each breath scraping against the knot of fear lodged in her throat. She wanted to vanish, to fold into the shepherd's body until she no longer existed in the eyes of the room. But the dog's presence held her steady, as if his weight alone tethered her to the moment. Her lips parted once, then closed again. The shepherd blinked slowly, the kind of patient blink that softened the edges of her panic. She reached down, her fingers tangling in the thick fur at his neck. Her hand shook violently, yet he did not flinch. He was stone and breath and warmth. She leaned into him until her forehead pressed against his collar, hiding her face from the waiting eyes. And then, so soft it nearly dissolved before it reached the air, came a single word: stop. It cracked the silence like a splintering branch. The sound was fragile, trembling, but it carried weight, it carried memory. The gallery stiffened. The judge froze mid-breath. One of the jurors covered her mouth, eyes wet. It was not the polished, rehearsed testimony the court had anticipated. It was the raw exhale of a child's deepest wound. Her voice was smaller than the microphone's reach, yet the room heard it. Everyone heard it. The shepherd's ears twitched, his head lifting slightly as if affirming the word's importance. The girl clung tighter to him, as though speaking had cost her everything she had, and the dog alone could hold her upright. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, his papers suddenly foreign in his hands. The prosecutor's pen stilled, no longer scribbling arguments. Even the judge, whose robes cloaked her in authority, seemed momentarily stripped of language. What was the procedure when a child's first word in court was not an answer to a question, but a plea to the past? The girl's breath came faster, her chest fluttering beneath the oversized sweater. Her eyes stayed fixed on the shepherd's fur, not daring to meet the stares around her. But the word hung there undeniable, echoing in the chambers like a bell that could not be unrung. Stop. It was more than a memory. It was a fragment of every night she had hidden under her blanket, every slammed door, every moment she wished her small body could halt the chaos around her. One syllable, worn thin with use in her mind, now spoken aloud to ears that could not pretend not to hear. The courtroom shifted. Something invisible cracked open. The system, built on walls and codes, had not prepared for this, a child speaking not as evidence, but as a soul refusing to remain invisible. Encouraged by the shepherd's calm, she whispered again, barely louder, almost testing the sound of her own voice. Stop. This time it carried a different tone, not just memory, but defiance. The dog pressed his flank closer to her legs, grounding her trembling body. She felt the vibration of his low breath, steady, reassuring, as if telling her, "You can go on. I am here." The judge finally cleared her throat, voice softer than before. "You can take your time." It was the closest the system could come to tenderness. But the girl did not answer. She was not speaking for the judge, or for the jury, or for the polished men who scribbled notes with intent to weaponize them. She was speaking because the shepherd listened. Her next words were halting, broken, more images than sentences. She whispered of doors, of loud voices, of too dark. She did not weave a narrative. She scattered fragments like shattered glass across the courtroom floor. Each shard caught the light of truth, sharp enough to cut through the practiced language of the lawyers. Some jurors shifted in their seats, hands pressed to their mouths. The prosecutor's eyes watered. Even the bailiff, accustomed to order, stood straighter as though guarding the moment from interruption. But the girl was not aware of them. She was aware only of the shepherd, his unyielding patience, the way his fur held the salt of her tears as they finally spilled. Words stumbled from her lips, raw and uneven, but each one carried the weight of nights she had endured in silence. The system, so rigid, was forced to bend beneath the honesty of a child who had not been coached, who could not be scripted. Her body shook with the effort. By the time her voice cracked into silence again, she slumped forward, pressing her entire weight against the shepherd. His body did not move. He held her as steady as stone, her anchor against the ocean of the courtroom. And in that silence, after the first word had been spoken, no one in the room could return to what they had been before. The trial ended not with the slam of a gavel, nor the crescendo of lawyers' voices, but with a silence that carried the weight of something permanent. The little girl sat on the bench outside the courtroom, her stuffed rabbit tucked beneath her arm, the shepherd lying at her feet with his head resting on his paws. The corridors that once towered over her now felt strangely smaller, as if her words, fragile, trembling, had carved cracks into the walls themselves. Adults bustled past in muted tones, papers tucked away, verdicts whispered. But she no longer flinched at the sound of closing doors. The storm had passed. In its wake, the air felt lighter, touched by something unfamiliar but real. The shepherd stretched, his ears flicking at the echo of voices down the hall. The girl slid down from the bench and wrapped her arms around his neck, pressing her cheek into the coarse fur that smelled faintly of grass and leather. For a long while she said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. Her words had already filled the room behind her, words that could never be taken back. The courtroom had listened, not because procedure demanded it, but because a child had finally spoken where silence had once ruled. And though the legal machinery would grind on in its slow, relentless way, the hearts of those who sat in that chamber had been irrevocably altered. They had seen what truth looked like when it came not from statutes or evidence, but from the mouth of a child leaning against a dog. Outside, the late afternoon sun spilled through the tall courthouse windows, painting golden stripes across the floor. The girl followed the light with her eyes, squinting as if adjusting to a brightness she had forgotten existed. The world beyond those glass panes no longer looked like a fortress. It looked open, waiting. Her guardian approached hesitant, carrying the weight of gratitude and sorrow both. But the girl did not look up. Her gaze remained fixed on the shepherd, whose steady breathing seemed to promise that the terror of nights past did not own her future. She stroked his ear slowly, her small fingers steady for the first time in memory. There was no sudden laughter, no grand declaration of triumph. Healing did not arrive in fireworks. It arrived quietly, in the way her shoulders no longer curled inward, in the way her breath came without hitch, in the way she dared to imagine tomorrow. The shepherd rose finally, shaking out his coat, his body stretching tall above her. She slipped her hand back onto his harness as they walked toward the heavy courthouse doors. They opened this time not like prison gates, but like thresholds, and the cool air that rushed in smelled not of disinfectant and paper, but of autumn leaves, earth, and the faint sweetness of freedom. The little girl paused on the steps, looking out at the city bathed in fading sunlight. For the first time, the shadows did not frighten her. She reached down, patted the shepherd's side, and whispered, not for the courtroom, not for the adults, but for him alone. Safe now. The words were carried off by the breeze, but he heard them. His ears turned, his head tilted, his tail brushed against her leg in quiet reply. And together, child and dog descended the steps, leaving behind the cold machinery of law and stepping into a world where silence had been broken, where the smallest voice had found its echo. The courthouse stood unchanged behind them, stone and glass and walls still thick with secrets. But something had shifted. A truth had been spoken that no file could contain, no verdict could erase. And somewhere in the heart of a 3-year-old child, a light flickered back to life, fragile, yes, but real. It glowed in the simple act of walking hand in harness with the one who had listened when no one else could. The day faded into dusk, the sky streaked with orange and violet. The girl's silhouette, small against the shepherd's, stretched long across the pavement. She no longer looked like a shadow. She looked like a beginning. And in that quiet afterlight, the story ended not with finality, but with promise. The promise that words, once spoken, could never again be silenced.